It is the most profitable company in the world today. Last year, it made more money than Apple and Microsoft combined. What does it do? It sells oil. And mind you, it's completely controlled by the Saudi state, or rather its royal elite. And this is already the most profitable business of the huge country of 215 million people, Brazil. They also deal in oil and are strictly controlled by the state. Norway, France, Great Britain, India, in all of these countries with the most diverse economies, the most profitable are those who make money from oil. Now look at the Chinese top. Which company makes the most money? You can guess it's not some Huawei or Alibaba or Transcend. Anyone from IT people to Chinese construction workers are being beaten to the punch by China's two biggest oil companies. They're also state-owned, by the way. And even if you look at the big American companies, you'll find that Google makes less than Exxon, Chevron beats Ford and General Motors, and Meta and Zuckerberg's Facebook makes less than the oil men at Marathon Petroleum or Phillips 66. And you know why? Because oil has been the most traded commodity on Earth for decades. And you don't just need it to trivially put gas in your car. Even if it's electric, oil is used to make the tires for it, the roads for it to drive on, the paint for the body, the plastic and leather for the interior, the cosmetics and perfume for the human appearance, the fresh food to get to the store and home on time, and billions of other goods that move around the planet every second, thanks to oil. It's the lifeblood of the global economy. But not just the economy, oil is the key resource of modern warfare. Without it, tanks don't move. Planes and missiles don't fly, ships don't go to sea, and armies of soldiers don't go anywhere. Now look at this chart. According to it, more than half, and by other calculations, 75% of the world's oil is produced and sold not by private and supposedly more efficient owners, but by the very same state-owned companies. After all, this resource is power, or vice versa. Whoever has the power will always take the necessary resources. Who is the richest person in the world? The answer varies from year to year. Today, it is again the Frenchman Bernard Arnault, owner of Louis Vuitton, Moet, Hennessy, and other luxury goods. In the 22nd, the innovator Elon Musk is the leader. Before that, for 4 years in a row, the richest is Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, preceded by Bill Gates. Once in first place, investor Warren Buffett, Mexican oligarch Carlos Sims. But all of these modern billions in no way reach the richest man in history. You probably know his name, John Rockefeller. Yes, at the beginning of the 20th century, his fortune was estimated at $1.4 billion. Wait, but the same Arnault today has assets worth more than $200 billion. All true, but if you recalculate Rockefeller's wealth in modern money, taking into account the inflation for almost 100 years, you get all $340 billion. But much more importantly, at his peak, Rockefeller held in his hands almost 1% of the world economy, well, or 3% of the American economy. And who does not know his fantastic fortune Rockefeller will make on the main technological innovation of the era, oil, and more precisely, on how to use this resource wisely. It should be noted that Rockefeller is not a scientist, not an inventor, and not even a discoverer of oil. For example, the first plant distilling this oil and transforming it into other useful substances would be invented in Russia, and ordinary Orthodox peasants, the Dubinin brothers. One of them will even receive a commemorative medal from the Russian Tsar with the inscription, "For useful things." But the guys would not become oligarchs because at the beginning of the 19th century, the time for oil was still young and not profitable, and the plant itself was burned down by Caucasian mountaineers. The first real mass product from oil kerosene is not Rockefeller, but Canadian physicist Abraham Gesner. And in Europe, at about the same time, a similar substance is distilled by a Polish pharmacist from Limburg, now Lviv. And even the first commercial oil wells in different parts of the world in Baku, Canada, Poland, or Pennsylvania appear without the participation of John Rockefeller. However, it is Rockefeller, not all of these gentlemen, who would become the first dollar billionaire in history. because he would create something that today is much more important for success, money, and power than just inventing, producing, or selling something. The young entrepreneur would create the world's first vertically integrated company, Standard Oil. Simply put, Rockefeller would buy up everything and everything involved in producing, refining, transporting, and selling oil. That is, to control the three whales of any business: production, logistics, and distribution. And when the puzzle is formed and turns into a giant octopus that monopolizes American transportation, production, finance, and politicians in its tentacles, politicians at the very top, and especially President Roosevelt, it becomes clear that this beast must somehow be cut into pieces. Otherwise, the country will soon be ruled by him and not by the White House. As a result, Standard Oil was broken up by antitrust into 34 companies. Rockefeller himself was already retired by this time, and the division of his brainchild would not suffer in any way. On the contrary, he would remain peacefully the richest man in the world. And the founder's business never died at all. It would be continued by the famous Seven Sisters. And if the oil giants in the United States received new restrictions from the government year after year, they would turn around from their hearts abroad. Throughout the 20th century, they find and buy up oil fields all over the planet. And by 1973, they control as much as 85% of oil produced on Earth. And even if today to estimate conditionally the heritage of Standard Oil, it will turn out that in total it costs less than $1 trillion with a common profit at the level of world leaders, the same Apple. And this does not take into account other heirs of American oil expansion. Remember that I started with the most profitable company in the world, Saudi Aramco? Yes, today it is actually the property and main breadwinner of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. With this money, the country can afford to live large, ennoble the present, design a fantastic future, or simply buy the world's best soccer players or major sports tournaments. But at first, the company was simply called Aramco, which translates as Arabian American Company, because it was the Americans who, almost a century ago, received permission from the Saudi king to explore for oil in the Arabian desert. Well, because in fact they offered the most advanced technologies, but much more importantly, pleasant conditions for the Saudi ruler: cash gold. But when black gold was found there in immense quantities and flowed to the United States, it would turn out that the conditions were favorable only for the Americans themselves. Saudi Arabia got pennies on the dollar for its own oil, but the Americans give royal names to all the fields they find. For example, the largest oil field on the planet, 280 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide, is called Ghawar, which means king, Abqaiq for queen. But regardless of the names, these deposits are a gift to the states. Look how compactly they are concentrated in a small area. It is cheap and easy to extract oil, and most importantly, all this wealth is very close to sea trade routes. Now, let's move on to Venezuela. This country is believed to have the largest oil reserves in the world. Watch out, it is also very conveniently located to extract it and export it quickly by sea. You can guess that the first fields in Venezuela would be developed by the familiar British and American boys from Standard Oil. Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Indonesia, Bahrain have a similar history. In all these countries, the oil industry was established by the British or Americans under ideal conditions for themselves. As in the case of Saudi Arabia, the local rulers were immediately paid in hard currency, preferably in gold, and in return they gave access to potential resources with a contract for tens of years ahead. The foreign businessmen quickly found oil, setting up drilling rigs, pulling pipes to the nearest ports, and carefully exporting the pumped oil. And the states, or rather their leaders, got at best a small percentage of each barrel or ton exported. At first, the poor, uneducated leaders were happy with such circumstances. It is clear that they had nothing but camels and sand. And here, all the American presidents come to shake hands with them and even give them gold in advance. But as time goes by, more and more oil was found and pumped out of their subsoil. The profits of Western companies grew, and since these companies, according to the precepts of the father of the founder Rockefeller, calculatedly controlled everything: extraction, processing, delivery, and sale, it means that they also determined the prices. Take a look at a historical chart of how much oil has cost from World War II to today. It's like two different lives. Here, in the right part, there is such a free heartbeat of the barrel, while in the left part, everything is suspiciously stable and the watershed, or rather the oil divide, runs exactly along the 1973 line. You remember, that's when the world oil crisis happened. Another Arab-Israeli war starts, the West traditionally supports the Jewish state with arms and oil, and the Arab countries in response stop supplying oil to the US and its other allies. They also drastically cut production. What happens to fuel prices? They nearly quadruple in a matter of months. But the war with Israel is not only a pretext. The bigger reason is that the oil-producing countries are finally fed up with being essentially robbed. Remember when I said that the 7 American sisters would then control 85% of all the oil produced on Earth? Well, compare that to where that oil comes from. More than half of it is pumped out of North America and Europe. There you have it, the roots of global conflict. Some don't want to lose free oil and cheap energy for their civilization of cars, planes, ships, and industries, and others realize that they are creating the basis for this prosperity for a pittance. There's the technology, and then there's the oil itself. Some are threatening to nationalize it, that is, to take over all the oil fields, and others are pointing to their own military arguments that it is better not to do so. But at the same time, all of them are already dependent on each other, or rather on oil. And here is a clear proof. In the mid-60s of the last century, oil overtook coal and remains the main source of energy for mankind. And so far, there have been no credible contenders to replace it. This means that the world is living under the laws of the oil age, which was just beginning to take shape. You've probably heard of OPEC. It stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Today, they claim up to 80% of the world's reserves. The countries meet all the time and agree on who and how much to produce in order to keep prices at a profitable level for everyone. Well, because for many of them, oil is almost the only solid source of money for the budget. Today, by the way, there is an expanding OPEC Plus format that includes Brazil, Russia, Kazakhstan, and other oil-producing countries that also need stable prices. But in 1960, when only the first 5 countries were united in OPEC, the main goal for them was to take control of the oil reserves in their own countries, which were simply in the hands of the Americans, the British, and other Westerners. First, the Venezuelan leader and then the Saudi leader made demands on the American oil companies, saying, "You seem to be embezzling too much money, and if you don't share it, we're going to nationalize the oil." It was more of a bluff at the time. Here it is, the famous meeting aboard the military cruiser Quincy, when the American president and the Saudi king sign a pact. According to it, the Americans get exclusivity on Saudi oil, and the Saudis get American guarantees of security for their then young state. But everyone's appetite grows quickly, and to keep the conflict from spreading, the Americans offer a technique that will go down in history as the golden gimmick. According to it, they generously share half of the oil profits, and this money goes directly to the Saudi king. Not directly, but into the U.S. Treasury. It's like a parent giving a child an allowance card, but seeing and controlling where they spend it. And it turns out to be such a nice pocket ruler. In general, it is obvious that without an organization like OPEC, the oil-producing countries of the East and the South would not have been able to achieve financial and political independence. But at the very moment of the oil crisis, when OPEC showed its strength for the first time and began to influence production and prices, another organization appeared, the International Energy Agency. Today, it has even more countries than OPEC Plus, 31 countries. What unites them all? Well, if we exclude Norway and recently Mexico, it becomes clear that all these countries need to buy oil because without it, their economies will fail. And in numbers, these guys account for 75% of the world's total demand. So we get a picture of the modern world. There is OPEC Plus, which benefits from high and stable oil prices because they sell it, and there is the International Energy Agency, which has exactly the opposite interests. They have to buy it, on the contrary. And in the middle of these two chairs are China as the main buyer of oil and the United States. On the other hand, they pump the most oil in the world and need stable, high prices to make their shale oil fields profitable, for example. But on the other hand, their economy is not just sitting on an oil needle. It is lying on a pile of such needles because the U.S. consumers buys and refines more oil than anyone else. To prove it, look at the capacity of oil refineries in different countries and see who is the main glutton. But in the modern world, countries are so interconnected, but even if you shoot sanctions against someone you don't like with one hand, the other hand can automatically shoot you in the foot. A few examples of varying freshness. Remember a couple of years ago about the news from Venezuela from every media channel? Who would stay in power there, Maduro or Guaido? Who would win, democracy or dictatorship? The states, I remind you, supported the democratic Guaido and opposed the dictatorial regime of Maduro. And to make it collapse sooner, Venezuela was forbidden to deliver its oil to American refineries. As a result, Maduro still rules Venezuela today, and last year he even boldly seized the richest oil field from neighboring West Guyana. But in a moment, the United States' own refineries will be in serious trouble. Let me explain. The fact is that the world's oil is not homogeneous. Somewhere, like the same American shale deposits, it is light with low sulfur content. Such oil is great for making gasoline, but if refineries are fed only with such raw materials, they will not be able to produce diesel fuel, fuel oil, or fractions for asphalt. So what do? We need heavy oil with a high sulfur content. Canada has such bituminous grades in the north, so they buy light American oil to make gasoline, while the states pay for heavy Canadian oil. But now move south of the country to the Gulf of Mexico, where the United States has the largest refineries in the country, and they need a lot of heavy, high-sulfur oil too. From where? Traditionally, from Venezuela. But you remember, you can't buy it there anymore. And this is where chemistry and logistics come into play, not politics. To make a long story short, the usual Venezuelan oil cannot be replaced by the same heavy Mexican or Canadian oil. The composition is different. Iran has similar oil in terms of chemistry, but unfortunately, the U.S. traditionally imposes sanctions on that country. It is possible to replace undemocratic Venezuelan oil with Russian Urals quality. At that time, it was not a sin to take it, so Russia began to supply the United States with 2 or 3 times more. But today, times are different. Russian oil by sea is blocked by U.S. and European sanctions, and there is a price ceiling on it, saying that others cannot buy it more expensive than $60 per barrel. But even under these circumstances, Russia continues to make about the same amount of money from oil as before. This is because, first of all, it is economically impossible to completely block Russian supplies, because Russia accounts for more than 12% of the world's total production, and if we go over the limit, the prices of other suppliers will soar to over $100 a barrel and higher. But for these major buyers, it is literally more expensive. And second, try to do it physically. Russia is the largest country on the planet with a lot of access to the sea, and it has one of the longest networks of oil pipelines. As a result, those European countries that do not have access to the sea, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, continue to buy Russian oil through the Druzhba pipeline. The Czech Republic would receive record supplies for 10 years in 2023. And note that the pipes pump oil directly through the territory of Ukraine. And for sea supplies, there is this so-called shadow fleet. First of all, it is necessary to find used tankers whose owners are willing to sell them to anyone in order to receive insufficient money for these old vessels. Well, that's how used oil prices shot up right after February 2022. Then the ships are renamed, repainted, and most importantly, the geolocation transponders are turned off, so it is not clear who is selling them and where they will turn up later. And then there are different options. A tanker flying the flag of some Panama or Marshall Island leaves the port empty, turns off its geolocation, and in the middle of the ocean is transferred oil from another tanker that is as unpredictable as the invisible tanker. There is a way not to turn off the transponder, but to fake the coordinates. It's called spoofing. Such a Hong Kong tanker will be caught with a strange signal somewhere between Japan and Korea, but satellite images will show that there are no ships at all in that place. But the tanker will be found near the Russian oil loading port of Kozmino, where the East Siberian Pacific Ocean pipeline ends. With disabled beacons, it is possible to mix oil in terminals of uncontrolled foreign ports or to fill larger tanks somewhere off the coast of Africa, Greece, or near the autonomous city of Ceuta, located in the Mediterranean Sea and disputed between Spain and Morocco. Well, the guys have to make money. The oil has to be mixed, and it is not clear whose blood it is. The only question is the price. What's the bottom line? According to the International Energy Agency, if in the 21st year more than half of the Russian oil is poured to Europe and the USA, and the same India gets only 1%, then 2 years later, on the contrary, 57% of the oil from Russia is bought by India and China. And you already know that these countries are among the largest oil refiners on the planet. Well, here you go. India has the world's largest refinery, Jamnagar, which means what happens to Russian oil on the Indian coast. That's right, it turns into gasoline or diesel and is happily sold to Europe, for example. And here it is, an illustrative scheme of travel, so to speak, from Russia with connections to India, China, Turkey, Emirates, Singapore, with the final landing in the same European Union, the United States, Japan, or even on the other side of the world, in Australia. And this is a direct illustration of what oil has done to the world, tied everyone together and turned the earth into a small, endlessly working and warring ball. Let's go back to the beginning. What was the first mass-produced product from petroleum? Kerosene. It gives cheap and constant light, and the man who has light can work harder, longer, and more efficiently, thus gaining economic advantages, and all nations will want it. The second mass product came when Mercedes-Benz and Diesel invented their internal combustion engines. Ford put everything on the assembly line, and it would literally run. Cars, airplanes, imagine how long it takes to travel from Europe to America or Asia in the coal age, and how quickly man begins to move in the oil age thanks to oil. But there is a third mass product: modern wars. They are also fought on oil and because of oil. The French Senator Henri Béranger would define the role of black gold very precisely right after the First World War. The blood of the earth, oil, brought us victory, because France started this war on horses and ended it with tanks, tens of thousands of automobiles, and airplanes. Hitler used blitzkrieg tactics in World War II largely because Germany didn't have endless oil reserves and they could only conduct rapid military campaigns, not a long war of attrition. And when the blitzkrieg on the Soviet Union is exhausted and he has to choose between a second attack on Moscow and a campaign for Caucasian oil towards Grozny and Baku, Hitler will choose the second and still lose. In the hardest time of August 1941, when the Germans were already at Smolensk and approaching Leningrad, the USSR still sent significant forces to occupy Iran with the British and gain strategic access to Persian oil. Japan occupies what is now Indonesia and will go to war with the US over oil because it has no reserves of its own. And imagine, by 44, to fuel their warships, the Japanese are extracting oil, attention, in Soviet Sakhalin with the consent of the USSR leadership. And why? Because Moscow in turn realized that they would not be able to fight a war on two fronts with Germany and Japan. Even Stalin sent oil to the Germans until the attack on June 22, 1941, hoping that Hitler would still attack Britain. But today, oil is going through Ukraine via Druzhba to the European Union, and the United States is not very keen on getting too much oil to the refineries in Russia. Who knows what effect this will have on oil prices? How many technical inventions mankind will come up with for the last century, and still the most money is made by any means on the fossil resources of the planet. Now listen to the famous words of old John Rockefeller.
93 years of my life, depressions have come and gone. Prosperity has always returned and will again.
There is a feeling that if oil could talk, it would say the same thing about itself. How many times in different years it is repeated that it is about to end, that there is nothing to sit on the oil needle, but it will never end and continue to bring prosperity to those who know how to use it properly and develop. You have just seen for yourself that every country in the modern world has different degrees of dependence. The USA, China, the European Union, Russia, Great Britain, and even Switzerland. For example, the overwhelming number of oil tankers are insured through London, and without this insurance they will not enter any major port, and through Swiss trading companies all this oil is sold. With the right approach, the oil industry is dragging many other industries with it. In fact, a similar situation is occurring today, where it is impossible to imagine a factory or production without IT. In the United States, the oil industry was born around the middle of the 19th century, when the country was recovering from the Civil War and entrepreneurs were looking for something new and promising to invest their money in, and they found oil. It causes a boom in the construction of railroads, and oil will grow the entire automobile industry in the United States, with the capital in Detroit. And the main thing is that oil is found in the USA, when it is an established state with different economies. But if you take Saudi Arabia or even Norway, it is completely different. In the case of the Saudis, the current state there appears on principle on oil and lives so long and peacefully because it receives security guarantees from the one who is interested in this oil, and it is essentially guarded. And if we take Norway, before they found black gold and then gas there, it was the most modest northern country by European standards. But today, in fact, the Norwegians are going to create the world's largest sovereign oil pension fund. They are going to buy up 1.5% of all the stocks in the world, and they have more money than the 10 richest people in the world put together. But all this is happening because there are only 5 million people in the country. And when the oil wealth comes to them, they do not invest it in ponds and skyscrapers and millions of jobs from Pakistan and Bangladesh, but quietly stack it up and distribute it for the future, because money loves silence. But in the Soviet Union of the 60s, when the country actually found oil for the second time, and it happened in western Siberia, and today it's Russia's largest reserves, such a trick to save money will not pass. This resource should be used to feed the population of a planned economy of 200 million people, and today, of course, it seems to be a strategic mistake. But what were the options? It develops science, exploration, chemistry, construction, industry. Remember I showed how compact the oil fields of Saudi Arabia and Venezuela are to the sea? Now estimate the reserves of the USSR. In order to sell them for foreign currency, they must first be brought from remote Siberia to the sea. And that means inventing a pipeline system from scratch, building it all, and adding refineries for themselves. The bad thing is not that someone pumps oil and sells it, but that all other industries are neglected. And as a result, at the end of the Soviet Union, even grain was brought with petrodollars, because there was not enough of its own. But there is only one conclusion here: to develop and not to make the mistakes of the past. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends. See you soon.